Welcome everyone again to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health series, weekly discussions of practice and science by experts in behavioral health and the law. This is a weekly series hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director in the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenters, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box anytime that you feel comfortable. Do know that we do hold questions until the end. We try to get to as many as we can. It's oftentimes not possible to get to all of them, however. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet that'll be posted in the chat box shortly. If you are pursuing APA continuing education credits, make sure again you keep an eye on the chat box, but the link for your CE survey will be in the latter points of the conversation of the presentation. Make sure that you check that link. If it's not working for you, copy it for later use, and make sure you download your certificate after completing the survey because we don't have access to those after the fact. As a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Thomas Gutile, who will be offering us a survival guide for testifying in court as an expert witness. But I'd like to circle back for this week. I'm very excited to introduce you to today's speaker, who will be discussing the Good Lives model of offense-related treatment. This is David Prescott. A mental practitioner for nearly 40 years, David Prescott is the director of the Safer Society Continuing Education Center. He's author and editor of 25 books in the areas of understanding and improving services to at-risk clients. He's particularly known for his work in the areas of understanding, assessing, and treating sexual violence and trauma. Mr. Prescott is the recipient of the 2014 Distinguished Contribution Award from the Association for the Treatment and Prevention of Sexual Abuse, ATSA, the 2018 recipient of the National Adolescent Perpetration Network C. Henry Kempe Lifetime Achievement Award, and the 2022 recipient of the Fay Honey Knopp Award from the New York State Alliance for the Prevention of Sexual Abuse and New York State ATSA. He's also served as ATSA's president previously, and his published work has been translated into Japanese, Korean, German, French, Polish, and Dutch. Mr. Prescott currently trains and lectures around the world, and quite frankly, it's a privilege having him joining us to discuss his monumental area of forensic and corrections-involved intervention. So David, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, we're just very thankful and excited to have you joining this series and really look forward to you sharing your expertise on just such a critical area and perspective in the work that we do. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was a particularly kind intro and sort of a nice reminder that time has marched on. So I was thinking about the things that have happened in the past. I'm going to say why I was thinking about this as we go along, but always interesting to see how for example, 2014 was quite a while back. I'll just leave it at that for right now. Welcome aboard. This is the Good Lives model, and I do just want to make a few introductory comments. And the first has to do with the nature of the work that many of us do, working to prevent sexual violence from happening, especially amongst those who have been known to perpetrate it, to commit acts of sexual violence, sexual abuse. As I say that sentence, I recall that many people define those words a little bit differently, and so I'm trying to do honor to those that have been harmed by abuse, those that have survived, and those that have not survived abuse are at the top of our minds at all times when doing this work. And so I really want to start from that point because of where all of this is going. I read a quote just this morning from a filmmaker, a film director from Japan a long time ago, named Akira Kurosawa, who said that being an artist means never averting your eyes. I thought that's a really amazing idea. And I think working in the field of abuse means always bearing witness to suffering and pain and difficulty. And I realize that's sort of a downer on which to start in our presentation. But what I'm really trying to capture here is this work and the Good Lives model are really both about understanding the nature of harm, and never turning a blind eye to it at the same time as we retain hope and optimism, enthusiasm, and compassion for the people with whom we work. And so I just wanted to start there because many of us get this flashbulb moment when it comes to abuse. We meet the person who's caused harm, we've read their record, and we get this sort of flashbulb image, like out of the old film noir movies, where the investigator or newspaper man comes in and takes the flash picture. And it can be difficult to get that image out of our head. And as far as meeting somebody goes. Then after we've met the person that's perpetrated this harm, that's committed acts of harm, we then get to see some of the rest of the story. And that's going to be a big theme with everything I talk about during our brief time together. What's the narrative? What's the backstory? What's upstream from even the most egregious conduct? And when I ask that question, very often that's where I find the humanity of those who've caused harm and been harmed. Many times it turns out to be the same person, as we'll see. So very interested in the narrative underlying abuse. And what I thought I would do today is basically emphasize everything that you won't get in the articles. So here's a little bit more about receiving continuing education credits. Partial credit will not be given. I mean, give us a break here. It's only one credit to begin with. So the Zoom usage and participation report, Zoom knows who you are and how long you spend with us, so it's no issue. And just submit the evaluation. We'll give you a QR code at the end. Enough said about that. I was also asked to clarify that I do not have a financial arrangement related to the content of this activity. However, it's very difficult for me to separate myself fully from anything having to do with the Good Lives model. But what I want to say is, for today, as happy as I am if you send any money in our direction, if you buy a book or what have you, don't spend any money on anything until you've emailed me directly. And I will send you some free articles and scans of a book chapter if you're interested in it. So I intend to do as much as I can for free, giving it away. It's just the stage of life that I'm in. The views expressed in this presentation are mine and don't represent the policies and positions of the University of New Mexico. I looked at this morning and thought, well, that's probably pretty good because I don't even know what the policies and positions of the University of New Mexico even are. So this isn't just a disclaimer, it's a two-way street in that regard. Alongside that, this is my contact information. You're free to get in touch with me, as I've just said. I love providing information. It might take me a few days. I really can't get involved in deep case consultation, but I'm happy to be a resource to you in any way. And nobody's ever asked me about the picture in this slide, but I do come from the land of that really belongs to the Abenaki, the people of the dawn here in the northeastern U.S. And I just include a picture to honor them. So yeah, this is just where I live and what my idea of a good life looks like. The beautiful Green Mountain state of Vermont. I took this photo on a nearby hiking trail. So I just wanted to share a happy image from my part of the world. Okay, so the Good Lives model itself started with the guy in the upper left-hand corner of this slide. That's Tony Ward, and that's what he looks like most times. He's one of the sweetest, nicest, and kindest people I know. As an academic, he tends towards all things philosophical. He's a philosophy student par excellence, but also is a very good clinician. You also see at the top of the slide a very dear friend of mine named Gwen Willis, who is also in New Zealand. And I just want to give her credit. She actually designed the slide background. that I'm working with today. And you also see Tiffany Dent, who is my co-author on the Good Lives model for adolescent females and young women. You see Mary Falcon, who's been the editor of most of the books published on the Good Lives model. A couple of friends of mine in Norway who've done the best implementation of the Good Lives model, as far as I can tell. Christine Friestad, Ingeborg Sandbucht. You also see Mayumi Purvis, who did some fantastic work making the Good Lives model accessible to case managers before she left the field, and now works as a solution-focused therapist. And of course, Pamela Yates, who I understand spoke with you a few weeks back and also co-authored a couple of things, well, actually several things with yours truly along the way and in the past. So this really is, I am speaking on behalf of a community of practitioners and researchers and the like. So just a bit on historical context. The Good Lives model really started against this backdrop. When I started doing this work in 1984, gosh, almost 40 years ago now, this image just speaks to what treatment looked like to me. Treatment could be a harsh and confrontational, mean-spirited affair. Time doesn't allow me to go into all of the details, but I do remember some tense moments when I observed treatment groups for substance use disorders back in the mid-1980s. It was almost a fashion statement to be really mean-spirited with one's clients, and everybody believed that they were doing good. And I guess I want to underline that point. Everybody thought they were doing what was right, and nobody had really actually studied it meaningfully. Taking this a step further, there was a classic meta-analysis by Paula Smith and her colleagues, 117 studies. This was 22 years ago now, and no form of punishment reduced reoffense risk. If we're going to punish people, we should only think of it as punishment. We shouldn't think of it as rehabilitative. There's been some recent exceptions to this in some examinations of length of prison sentence, and that some seem to be worse than others. And that there's been slight impacts through shorter sentencing, but through medium-sized sentences. But what's really been clear to me, looking at the massive major meta-analyses, have been overall, most times, most places, punishing people doesn't actually get them to change. Even though many of our clients will say, well, when I got locked up for the third time, that really changed me. I would submit that probably the person looked at themselves in the mirror at that point and made changes to themselves. There's a lot to this that we don't have time to get into, but I wanted to start someplace. Again, fascinating study, Paula Smith and her colleagues. I recommend looking it up. Where I've landed after reading lots of confusing and sometimes contradictory research is that by the most rigorous and conservative standards, punishment is punishment. Meanwhile, treatment can work. This has also been controversial at various times. Treatment can work, and treatment can be better with the right community supervision. And what I'm really getting at here is when people re-enter the community after having been in some severe form of punishment, very often probation officers or the right friends are the beginning of how they reestablish roots in the community and become stable, become occupied, become accountable to other humans. Start to have plans for the future, get involved in the right programming, and ultimately have everything to lose by doing it again. What I've thought about over the years is I want to help people build a balanced and self-determined lifestyle, one in which causing harm to others is unnecessary and undesirable. In the old days, we used to focus on something called relapse prevention. It's kind of faded into history, although you still hear about it in the substance use disorder world. But it focused so much on how not to do things again in the future, how not to do things, what not to do. If I see a kid crossing the street, I'll go in the other direction, etc. But it never really seemed to focus all that much on what people could do. And that, I think that for me is one of the central reasons why, first of all, I got involved with the Good Lives model, and also why so many people seem to enjoy working with it. You know, it's one thing to get the research that says, yes, this works in a randomized controlled trial. And it's another thing to see what are the moving parts. And very often I found that practitioners really enjoy working within this kind of a framework. But I'll get to that in just a moment. First, now this might seem tangential. It's not. But this was a headline that caught my attention about a decade ago. It happened in California. Now, I live in Vermont. I don't get to California all that often, but I think of it as a fairly left-leaning place where policies would probably be in the direction of rehabilitation and not simply punishing everybody. But the headline said, female inmates sterilized in California prisons without approval. Very bottom line is they had been pressured by psychiatrists, by doctors, and heavens knows who else. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that many of them, if not most of them, were men. And basically the message was along the lines of, given how much trouble you're in for crimes that you've committed, perhaps you should consider getting a tubal ligation. Anyway, these women got out of prison and said this really wasn't right. And California ended up having to pass a law to prevent it the following year in 2014. And the reason I show this is because of all of the questions that it really poses. What are the forces that turn medical care into coercive action? Where was the Hippocratic oath of do no harm? Many of us think about abuse prevention as coming in many forms, like preventing abuse in the general public, preventing abuse amongst at-risk people, preventing abuse amongst those who have already abused. But we often forget the fourth kind of prevention, which is preventing our interventions from themselves causing harm. Many good ideas have turned out not to bear fruit because they were so badly misapplied. As the great criminologist Fay has often said, the question isn't, does nothing work? The question is, has nothing been implemented properly? Now, I've talked to Fay about that, and she denies that she's the originator of that phrase. But she certainly has said it a lot. She's absolutely right. So under what conditions do people acquiesce to those who have more power and control over them? And importantly, can the right policies, models, and frameworks prevent this kind of horror? How do we know when we're truly collaborative? And do we have methods for including our clients' voices along the way? So here's another one, and this gets more specific to those of us working in the field of preventing sexual violence. This was the cover of Newsweek some time back. You might recall that a number of states not only made conversion therapy unethical, but also illegal. And this raised a number of questions for me about, what about all those people that are trying to help people with a pedophilic disorder manage their sexual interests and arousal? How close do some of our interventions come to conversion therapy, which in this case was intended to help, gay people be more straight, since it was never about making straight people gay, if we're honest. Now, I'm saying all of this very, very quickly. A lot of harm took place, and you used to be able to see some really scary videos on YouTube of people that secretively took video of conversion therapy group sessions, and so on and so forth. But there's a real question about how much do we change anybody's sexuality? What are the bounds? How do we know when something is with or against somebody's will? Personally, I've concluded with the idea that probably we can't change what somebody fundamentally wants, but we can absolutely change how they behave around what they want. And there's a whole world out there of people who recognize that they have a sexual interest in children and do not want to act on that interest. And in fact, some of the research is quite eye-opening indeed. But time prevents. Email me if you'd like some of the studies or blog posts that I've written. Again, collaboration and the therapeutic alliance have to be key, along with the service user or client's actual voice. Now, fast forward to 1979 from our early beginnings, and Edward Borden defined the therapeutic alliance as really consisting of these three things. Do you have agreement on the nature of your relationship? And does your client understand how you fit into their life? Are you an extension of the police power of the state? Are you somebody that can help them? Or do they just view all therapists as somebody they're supposed to express their feelings to? Do you have agreement on the goals of treatment? And do you have agreement on the tasks of treatment, the way you're going to do things? I also am a big fan of motivational interviewing. I've done a lot of training and implementation of motivational interviewing, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes clients are very wary and suspicious of it at first. We have to adjust our style depending on how we go about things. But it's this agreement on goals that I think is particularly important. John Norcross came along and added what he called strong client preferences. But this leads me to the definition of evidence-based practice as promulgated by the APA, which involves, individual characteristics and culture. And all of these things important to take into account. We know that as by the time 1994 had rolled around, that over 1,100 studies had emphasized the importance of the alliance. So ideally, I've come to view, over all of these years, I've come to view effective treatment, effective psychotherapy as being like a kind of choreography. I'm picking here on Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, two very famous dance partners from way, way back. And I always like to say, if you look closely, Fred is looking at the audience to see if they're looking at him. And Ginger is looking at Fred's feet so that she can match him backwards, step for step, and in high heels. And I've long said our job is to be a little bit more like Ginger Rogers along the way, matching our client's step backwards and in high heels, metaphorically speaking, of course, and then gradually moving to dance in the direction of the balanced and self-determined lifestyle I spoke about earlier. And likewise, I think that Ringo Starr, formerly of the Beatles, really summarized what good treatment looks like, especially for people who've been in trouble with the law and are trying to rebuild their lives. Very often, the secret of good treatment and the secret of professional longevity, by the way, is when we can get by with a little help from our friends. So just some imagery to think about as we go forward, putting all of this into some context. So here we get into the Good Lives Model approach and core principles. This is great. I'm looking at my clock and I've made the decision that we're doing okay on time. This is the kind of content I could talk about for 4 minutes. And last week I spoke about for 4 days. So there's really a lot to it. And that's why I say, feel free to email me and I'll send you some articles. Tony Ward and his colleagues with the late, great Ruth Mann and Teresa Gannon one day observed our clients want better lives and not simply the promise of less harmful ones. And I really think that nothing truer was ever said. Now, you kind of have to give some of us a break here, because in the old days, we became very risk focused. And that made sense. We didn't have any good risk assessments. There were times, I remember when people said, will we ever have a risk assessment measure that will break the forensic sound barrier of 0.40 R correlation? And then, of course, the R correlation isn't really even used anymore. But then, the first measure did, and so on and so on. So we became very risk focused. What are the risk factors we have to look after, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't until much more modern times that we started to think about what are the characteristics of an effective therapist in this field? What are the protective factors, the strengths, the client assets that will help somebody prevent future offending? And what does the desistance process actually look like, et cetera, et cetera? By the way, I don't have time to get into it, but if you've never read the book Making Good, by Shad Maruna, Making Good. It's published by APA Press. I think it was 2001 it came out. Really, really great text, an important one. Danielle Harris in Australia has also written a book much more recently on desistance processes. I would recommend people look at their work as well. Tony Ward has done quite a bit in desistance. The late Richard Laws did as well. But our field was always very risk focused. And so we looked at our clients as if they were sort of disembodied harbingers of risk. Way too often. Tony Ward referred to it as pincushion theory, that our clients were like pincushions with all of these risk factors stuck into them, and that people seem to want to just remove the pins, one risk factor at a time, without thinking about the promise of a better life. Strange how we prioritize these things. It seems weird looking back. And of course, the people who came before us were not as dumb as we often think that they were, just as we are not as smart as we often think that they are. Many have made that observation before me, in fact. Gwen Willis, my colleague who I mentioned before, interviewed a fellow who said, you know, as a kid, I had lots of examples of what I didn't want to be. I spent my life trying not to be those things. And then when an aide asked me about 5 years ago what I did want to be, I had no idea. Yeah, so lots to say about this. We, you know, if we had lots of time, I'd have you run through an exercise of just asking yourself, what does a good life mean to you? My good life plan implicitly has changed over the years. It used to look like being a professional musician back when I was a teenager. Then it looked like being a social worker, then a clinician, then a husband, then a father. And then a good life for me sort of involves nowadays at my age, kind of figuring out what it's really all about, the various roles we take on, and without trying to lose our soul along the way. So there's lots of fulfillment out there to be had. And just as I've spent my career on guard for burnout, I also look for those glimmers of joy that appear in doing this work. What does a good life mean to you? So from there, I then like to think in terms of going upstream with some of our clients. My favorite client statement after all these years is, look, I'm not gonna, you can't make me. Especially because we used to think of that resistance. We used to think of that as resistance. And now I would think of it as, I do not wish to change, thank you very much, as well as an interpersonal problem, you can't make me. Even more, when I think about that, I think also about upstream from there is a powerful drive to making one's own decision, a powerful drive to independence, powerful drive to autonomy. So I think I use the exercise something like this. Just take a second and think about anything that you would like to have in your life right now. I very often say, you know what I want in my life right now is actually a sip of coffee. I'll let you think up your own thing. And the next question becomes, I'll explain the picture in just a moment, but well, maybe I'll explain it now. I used this once in a Norwegian context, and this is what a Norwegian lunch sandwich looks like. It's called a matpakke. And I just use it as an example. Maybe you're hungry. Maybe you're like me and you just want a cup of coffee, but maybe you want world peace. Or maybe I should take the word Tesla out. I'm not happy with Elon Musk these days, but they certainly drive them a lot in some parts of the world. Yeah. So what's anything that you would like? And if you had that, then what else would you have in your life? David, what would you have in your life if you had more coffee? Well, maybe I'd have a little bit more energy. I don't know. I like coffee, and it's half calf actually. So I would also have maybe a little bit more liquid, keeping my my throat ready for talking. I don't know. Well, David, if you had more energy and your throat was perfectly clear and in great shape, then what else would you have? And I'd say, well, then I would feel like I was better equipped to do my work. Well, if you were better equipped to do your work, then what else would you have in your life? And I would say, I'd feel like I had a sense of excellence, that this is something that I can do well, something that I have to offer the world. And if you had that in your life, then what would you have? And I would say, then I would feel I had a life well lived, that I gave more back to the world than I took from it. Perhaps something like that. In other words, we're trying to go upstream and see what we can learn. Take a violent offense. Very often, something like domestic violence happens because for once in his life, the guy just wants to do things his way. For once in his life, he wants to be his boss. Now, I'm not saying he's correct. I'm saying that's what he's thinking. That's his motivation in the moment. For once in my life, we're going to do things my way. No, for once in my life, we're going to drive the timing on when we do this. For once in our lives, I'm going to the casino and you can't stop me. For once in my life, I'm coming back drunk at daybreak and you don't have anything to say about it. You know, who knows? This kind of thing. Independence. It's upstream from this bad behavior might be this push towards independence. Now, a push towards independence, when channeled properly, looks like a pretty good thing. Wars of independence have been fought over it. Many of us have freed ourselves and turned and built a life based on the idea that we can become more than the circumstances that we've emerged out of. There's a lot to be said for the right kind of independence. So I use these examples, the Norwegian lunch, or in Norwegian culture, they have something called utepils, which means the first beer that you can drink outdoors after the long, harsh winter. This is not New Mexico, let me tell you. And so this is just, these are just some examples that you take an ordinary behavior like drinking a beer. It can have many motivations and it can meet many needs. A beer just may be a beer, but the first outside beer of the year, that's something else. I hope you're with me. I hope this is making sense. Likewise, I went to Krakow in Poland for a conference once, and I came across something called the Lord's Ark Church that was built by hand from the ruins caused by the Soviet invasion. And I realized it's not just a church. I don't particularly care for the architecture, but look at it. It was built from rubble. The Soviets came in with their tanks, and Krakow got off pretty lucky compared to some other cities like Warsaw. But this, metaphorically speaking, is a proud statement of independence. It is a great big middle finger extended towards the Soviet Union, and it's still standing where the Soviet Union is not doing so well. I guess that's maybe one way to say it. So there's lots of needs that get met by a single behavior. The Good Lives Model approach is intended to be strengths-based and positive. If you're not being strengths-based and positive, it's not the Good Lives Model. It's intended to be integrated with the principles of risk and need and responsivity, intended to be to awaken somebody's internal motivation to change. If everybody has a push to independence and connections with others, if everybody has a push towards being good at something in the world, connection, competence, and autonomy make up the basis of self-determination theory by Ryan and DC. If that's the case, connecting with individual motivation, intrinsic motivation, internal motivation, that's what this is really all about. And it focuses on how treatment, supervision, or case management can be to the client's advantage. And importantly, it involves two interactive goals: reducing and managing risk, and attaining a fulfilling life and psychological well-being. There are any number of things in this world that we approach, we seek to acquire or attain for their own sake. So in this way of thinking, we're looking at offending or abuse, violence as emerging from the pursuit of otherwise legitimate goals via harmful or maladaptive means. In other words, the underlying goals that we will find are not such a bad thing. They're shared by all of humanity. It's the ways that people go about trying to get them that can be completely unacceptable. The Good Lives Model proposes basically that all human beings are goal-directed and predisposed to seek what Tony calls primary human goods. I believe in this phrase, primary human goods, but I don't find it very useful when approaching a client who maybe has an IQ of 70 and isn't going to understand such high-minded concepts. So I operationalize them as goals. But I just want to stay here for a moment. Primary human goods are actions, experiences, circumstances, states of being, et cetera, that everybody seeks to attain for their own sake. And in this model, the secondary goods are just the ways and means that people try to get those broader overarching primary human goods. For example, me. I buy a lot of music. I sort of have a weekly allowance, and I buy music, and I buy the kind of music that gives me a sense of inner peace and peace of mind. I listen to music that most people would consider to be boring, but I also hear a lot of nuances in it, and my ears are trained for it. So it's very ambient, and I love it. And so the overarching life goal is inner peace, but the way I go about it is through a website called Bandcamp, and a huge Bandcamp here fan here. So I'm sorry that I have no stake in Bandcamp, so no finances to disclose. Within this way of thinking, then, the dynamic risk factors that we all study so much are actually markers for internal or external obstacles that block achieving primary goods in pro-social ways, in addition to increasing risk. Quick pause, and let me just say, I have a publication that's about to come out, and it's going to use me as an example. I see there's another Bandcamp fan here. Great. And so in it, there's a fictitious story that says David Prescott's doctor said to him one day, David, you're at risk. You're over 50. You're a man. You don't eat the world's greatest food, and you don't exercise very much. Now, the last two of those are not true. Just want to say that. But it's a case example, so go with it, please. And the doctor says there's two of those things that I can do something about, and two of those things that I can't. And so you look at me, you do a risk assessment, you say, okay, he's over 50, he's male. Those are his two static risk factors. But in this way of working, we want to know what's the story behind those. Why is my age and my gender counted against me as health risk factors? And the answer has to do with that men in America tend to, this is sort of most places, stereotyping and whatnot, but we very often do have a tendency to work ourselves into the ground and not engage in the world's best health habits. Men are not always known to take great care of themselves, et cetera, which may come as no surprise to some people. But that's how it is. What I'm getting at, though, is that the static risk factors reflect dynamic processes. So the idea is, okay, David, now that you're over 50 and you're a man, what can you do to take better care of yourself? Then we're tapping more into my age and gender as internal or external obstacles that block achieving the rest of my goals. There's a lot of things I probably shouldn't do in the name of having fun or gaining inner peace. I'm at the age where jumping out of an airplane probably isn't as advisable as it would have been in my 20s, although who knows, people do it well. I've seen people do it into their 80s, et cetera. Okay. Just a quick note on narrative then, and there's a brief commentary because many articles have been written on it, but we get trained up to think about risk and protective factors. This is where I started. Risk and protective factors, and there is this problem of reification. We start thinking only of the factors. We think about the sexual interest in children without thinking about what's behind that, or the story underlying how did this person become exclusively sexually attracted to children. So we all encourage thinking in terms of the narrative underlying the risk or protective factors and getting to what's the actual story. How did events result in this factor? Okay. So in this way of working, Tony originally proposed 10 primary human goods, which he also refers to as prudential values. It's worthy of a Google search. And how important these things are in our lives determines our conceptualization of a good life. which is reflected in a good life plan, which is something that we have either implicitly or explicitly. I just know next time I'm looking for inner peace, I might be looking at, at my favorite artist's music that I haven't bought yet, or joining a meditation group, because that's another thing I enjoy doing. And I didn't sit down to plan these activities out, but they are a kind of implicit plan for me. The idea here is that the more pro-socially we're able to attain these goods or goals, the better able we're going to manage any risk factors that we might have. So these are the primary human goods on the left. Pamela Yates and I operationalized them as what we called at the time common life goals. These we used the phraseology because we wanted to make it a life goal common to everybody. And so what we found was, as you'll see in the slide, I just sort of I turned 4 of them into this kind of tawny color. Personal choice and independence, peace of mind, relationships and friendships, and happiness and pleasure. These states of happiness and pleasure seem to be the ones most often implicated in crimes in general and sex crimes in particular. Lots of domestic violence in the name of peace of mind and happiness. Lots of drug offending and drug abuse in the spirit of peace of mind, states of happiness and pleasure, etc. On the left, what you see here is that I then translated some of these into more sort of juvenile-friendly language and reconfigured them somewhat. But on the right, you see Andrews and Bonta's big 8 of risk factors. And what you see is they're kind of 2 sides of the same coin. The problem is that these risk factors, the names for our risk factors, things like sexual preoccupation, sexual deviance, things like this, were all written by researchers and never intended for client usage. And I've confirmed this with the developers of some risk assessment measures. If your therapist comes in and says, "We're here today to talk about your deficits in intimacy and self-regulation," holy cow, it would be more difficult to engage me in treatment, that's for sure. So the Good Lives model can be seen as a way of making these things more accessible and reframing them as goals that people can approach rather than risk factors that they need to avoid. You could ask yourself along the way, what are your prioritized primary human goods? So seeing that I've got a couple of minutes, going to open it up for questions really, really shortly. Let me just give you a couple of examples, okay? I'm going to just think about one client that I know who has a sexual interest in children. He's been in treatment a long time, and unfortunately, a prior treatment experience left him with the belief that he was incurably hopeless, that he would never do anything better tomorrow than he is doing it today. And that has been the biggest responsivity issue that we've had, is trying to get him to see that actually he is quite capable of making changes. As a teenager, and again, as a young adult, he abused children sexually who were in his mother's daycare. She had an in-home daycare program. He was upstairs, they were downstairs, but sometimes they ended up interacting. And it turned out that as he went back over his life, he always had perceived himself as in some form of competition with the kids, that his mother always seemed to spend more time paying attention to them. Over time, he wanted to know, especially as he went through puberty, he wanted to know what it was like to have sex with kids. Paradoxically, he says if he had really known at the time the harm he was causing, he probably wouldn't have done it. In some ways, I take him at his word on this. But initially, he had a revenge motivation. He wanted to kind of prove himself as, wanted to stand out from the crowd in his own way. I'm trying to say this all very briefly. He wanted to pursue independence and do what he wanted to do at the same time as he wanted to, to interact with these kids who he felt might be the only people who would ever accept him, or with whom he might be able to interact emotionally and to feel close to. Now, I'm trying to summarize many years of changes and treatment very, very briefly. But I think his offending was motivated both a little bit by independence, a lot by the connections that he had in this world, and also quite a bit because he thought it would feel good, thought it would give him brief states of happiness and pleasure, as well as peace of mind. And unfortunately, and very grimly, I think it did in some particular ways, but only in the short term. And he's actually been in treatment for a very long time since then. He does have a diagnosis of pedophilic disorder, as well as antisocial personality disorder. I've switched up some of the details so that he resembles, so that the person I'm thinking of is a more sort of generic example. But that might be one way of finding out what were his original motivations. Because if we came at him from the perspective of somebody motivated by an antisocial personality disorder and pedophilic disorder exclusively, then we might run into some kinds of difficulty in forming any kind of stable connection with him. So I think what I'm going to do is first acknowledge that I hope that this is really useful information up to this point and serves as a kind of foundation against which the research literature will make a little bit more sense. And then from here, I think answering any questions that you may have. I see one that just came in, and here's your evaluation link QR code. These things never cease to amaze me. Anthony, good to see you. Oh, I see we've got quite a bit of questions, so I'm going to get right into them. With regards to individuals who live with pedophilia, what has been your experience of working with these individuals who have comorbid intellectual disabilities? I've worked with this population while I've worked with adult males in corrections. So I'm going to say, yeah, it's a great question, and there is not enough about it that's out there. There's been very little research done in either assessment or treatment with these individuals. And a friend of mine and I did a presentation once that said, if risk, needs, and responsivity is so good, why do we still keep failing our clients? So the way that I've tended to look at this is that intellectual disabilities are a major responsivity factor, and that we need to tailor what we have to meet their special needs. Alongside intellectual disabilities, the other areas that I think about are learning disabilities and autism spectrum disorders. And in each case, I can count the number of experts who I would turn to for training on one hand. And that's in some ways really, really frightening. And so the client I was just trying to describe does have an IQ down in the low 70s. And has been appointed a guardian. Again, I'm thinking of one individual, but muddying the waters enough so that it's actually resembling many clients that I've worked with, etc. I hope that that's answered your question. Another one coming in is intimacy deficits, determination of self-worth, sex as a coping mechanism. All at once. These are excellent risk factors, and also examples of the language that I just, if somebody said, Mr. Prescott, we're here to talk with you today about your use of sex as a coping mechanism. I mean, the first place I'd go to is, I'm not sure you understand me all that well. You'll have to prove yourself along the way. And also the complexity of sex and sexuality, that these risk factors on their own just don't seem to capture the complexity of a human being. If we had time, I would say something along the lines of, you can think back on the last 5 times that you had sex. And it's always better if somebody else was having sex with you, little humor mixed in. And you could ask yourself, if you really go back over those things, to what extent, what were the various things you were seeking to accomplish? Sometimes we just want to be with our sweeties. Sometimes we just want to have fun. Sometimes we really need some kind of stress reduction. There can be many, many different motivations. Sometimes we might want to try something new, a completely novel experience. And so there can be many motivations here, and yet we only have a few risk factors. Another reason I always say we need to look at the narrative. And then I'm seeing a great question. It's from a true expert in the field. It's great to see you here. I'm honored, in fact. Would conceptualizing paraphilias, as a sexual orientation, change how the Good Lives model is implemented? Well, that is a great question. I know that there's been a lot of discussion in the literature and in the general public about paraphilias as a sexual orientation. I think I find myself in a position of being an agnostic in every regard. But if we did, in some cases, think about these things along, not just the paraphilic and the sexual behavior aspect, not just the urges, whatever that means, not just the thoughts and the fantasies, however we might define those, since very few people have defined fantasy very well. If we were to think about that and expand into the realm of the romantic qualities, or even sometimes some of the lifestyle elements that go along with these things, it'd be an interesting series of questions. My immediate thought about this is one of the goals that I didn't get to talk about, the primary human good of spirituality. Now, sometimes some people might say that particular sexual experience was a spiritual one. That's not actually what I'm getting at. With spirituality, I'm getting at the idea of having a meaning and purpose in somebody's life. Now, I will disclose right here and now, I am the genuine article of the cisgendered, straight, white, upper middle-aged male. That's me. It fits. And a lot of if you were to be my treatment provider using the Good Lives model, it'd be impossible for me to examine my life without looking at the fact that I am all of those things. And so I'm not saying I was put on earth to be cisgendered, white, of a certain age, et cetera, but that is so much of my identity. I would park it there. Now, if I were a member of a sexual minority, I think a lot of the meaning that I derive in my life, my relationship to the world and to the universe, really would fall into sort of those broader discussions of sort of why am I on this planet? And who am I, et cetera. I don't know if I've really meaningfully answered the question, but I certainly wonder about this. So I guess what I want to say is the Good Lives model ultimately is an overarching practice framework. Tony Ward has written about it as being a theory of rehabilitation, and that's certainly true enough. But it's also an overarching practice model. And I would say much depends on the individual that we would be working with to figure out a good answer to your question. There was something else I was just going to say to that. Practice framework. And then in terms of how we research it, and oh my gosh, I was just starting to answer the question that just came in. How would you determine whether the model has been well implemented? I actually was asked this by a group of people in Connecticut once, so I developed a fidelity monitoring measure. I thought it was a pretty good start. I went to Gwen Willis and we wrote it up, and it was published in French. So the good news was it existed. The bad news was you had to speak French to read it. And then we got Tony on board to make a few small changes, and we've published it in English, and I'm happy to share it. We wanted to answer the question, how do you know when you're doing the Good Lives model? And then this leads us to another question, which is, has the Good Lives model been proven to reduce sexual offending? To which my answer is, it might be a better question because of the overarching nature of the Good Lives model to say, have programs that implement the Good Lives model with fidelity been shown to reduce sexual offending? And I've seen some promising starts in that regard, but nothing that's been put through peer review yet. So many questions remain. I often wonder about many of the effects that would make it more successful in some studies, allegiance effects and other various forms of bias that creep into the mix and make solid research so difficult. So I hope that I've answered that question. And how about children who've had RTC treatment for sexual contact with other children? In a former job, I helped get kids referred for inpatient treatment, but we don't seem to have good outpatient treatment for these kids. Very briefly, let me see if I can do this one justice. My experience as a consultant is that I see a lot of states that go straight to high-level interventions for kids. This is because there's a judge out there someplace that says, well, somebody just give me the evidence on where I should put this kid, but I'm not seeing any credible people in this mix. So I'm sending them off to that juvenile detention center that tells me that they can do everything from A to Z, soup to nuts, et cetera, et cetera. And we take the kid who may have needed some behavior stabilization and end up keeping them in placement for way, way, way too long when their needs could have been met in the community. However, all too often, we don't have the resources that we do need in the community, and many community practitioners are, if we're honest, just plain scared of sex and sexuality and say, can't I just treat a good old-fashioned generalized anxiety disorder along the way? There's a lot of systemic issues, but my concern is that we get a lot of kids that end up in inpatient treatments that spend way too long there when the evidence is very clear that they would do better in the community. So that's about that. Anthony, anything else for the greater good before we call it a wrap today?
I think that's an outstanding preview for people that are relatively unfamiliar with this about what at the core what the Good Lives model is all about. We do have another question here about
yes,
better fidelity. Yeah.
Okay, we got a minute, so I'm going to do this. Would it prove better fidelity if trauma was measured? It's been a little while since I looked at it, but I believe that is in there. And my colleagues and I wrote a book on trauma-informed care and the treatment of people who've abused. I'm just going to leave it at that I think that this is really, really important to consider. And so I think that when we look at a holistic approach towards people's lives, we need to examine trauma and its role in etiology and present-day functioning. And of course, I'm all about accountability and not simply using this as the old-fashioned abuse excuse, as it's often been called. So thank you for a great question.
Yes. And thank you so much, David, for going over all of this and the importance of the Good Lives model as a mindset, let alone as an approach to intervention. I know from a professional / personal perspective, there was only my brief training and experience in the Good Lives model, but even intellectually and in that experience before that, it was really influential on my general approach to not just correctional or forensic work, but clinical work, and then just even perspectives on how we look at people anyway, and just really the shift on strengths and what we should do to advance our lives rather than just avoiding negative consequences. How do we contribute to the betterment of all? So I really appreciate all the information that you provide here for us and everybody else beyond this webinar.
Super.
Yes.
All right. Well, with that, I guess we're done. So we'll just leave, correct?
Indeed. That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week, we'll have Thomas Gutheil, who'll be going over a crash course for testifying in court. We hope to see you then. And until the next time, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.